Thank you, everybody, for listening to this webinar, and thank you, Disha, for setting it up. What I'll do is I'll run through about a dozen slides or so, and I don't have any objections. If you want to raise any questions, I think the best way to do that is through the chat function. I hope that that chat function will pop up on my screen, and otherwise I'm sure Disha will intervene. So if you have any questions, just let me know. Perhaps a few words about myself. I was working until recently with the International Union for Conservation of Nature in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam, and before that I was working for about 8 years in the financial sector, and prior to that with the Netherlands Enterprise Agency, even though I did not meet Caroline at the time. The webinar that we're going to do today is based on a report that was written by myself and Caroline in cooperation with the Ministry of Economic Affairs. You can download the report. It will obviously provide a lot more information than I can cover here in the webinar, but nevertheless, if you want to obtain a copy, just download it. You can also just Google it by Googling green bonds and IUCN. What I'll do today is run through 4 sections. First of all, just get a little bit more grip on what integrated landscape management means. So what is it, and in particular, how do investors view this? Then do a bit of a deep dive quickly into green bonds and what they are and how they relate to integrated landscape management. Cover a couple of examples from the Netherlands. Now, even though it is from the Netherlands, really the financial sector, I think, operates by global rules. So whatever works in the Netherlands should work equally well in other parts of the world. And then close off with a couple of final remarks and conclusions. So from my perspective, and as I mentioned, I was coming from the financial sector, and I started working at IUCN Netherlands, and all of a sudden people were talking about landscape approaches and integrated landscape management, and frankly it took me a while before I understood what integrated landscape management is all about. So the way I see it is that it's really a decision support tool that aims to reconcile competing claims on the landscape level. So basically you try to get as many users of resources within a geographical area, get them together and try to cooperate and identify trade-offs and priorities. And I think at the heart of the landscape approach is the multi-stakeholder platform. So this is where everybody comes together and where you align the different stakeholders with the ultimate goal to develop better governance rules. Now, what I've found in the research is that the better the ILM initiative is organized, the easier it is to raise capital. Now this may be pretty much like an open door to you, but I'll run through a couple of examples on how that works. So if you're a highly institutionalized landscape organization almost, then yes, you will be able to attract capital. If you're not that organized, if you're much more ad hoc, which is what we find mostly in the 400 plus landscape approaches that I've come across, mostly in developing countries, then it will be more difficult to attract capital. If you're looking at this from a perspective of an investor, you always ask yourself, who is my counterpart? So you don't finance a landscape approach, really. What you generally either finance projects within the landscape context, or you finance the organization that is organizing all of this. So if you're ad hoc, it's a bit more difficult. If you are well organized, it's relatively straightforward. And I'll give you an example from the Netherlands. In the Netherlands, we have water boards, and water boards, they govern basically, how we manage, to keep our feet dry. Now, these water boards have a very high degree of organization. As a matter of fact, they have elected representatives, they can raise taxes, and they have multiple stakeholders represented. So they have farmers, they have nature, they have government, etc. Now, they also have their own bank. It's the Dutch Water Board Bank, or NWB. And the NWB is one of the largest issuers of green bonds in the Netherlands. As a matter of fact, one of the predecessors of the one of the water boards that is currently still in operation issued a bond that still pays interest today. So in 1648, a perpetual bond was issued, and that still pays interest today. It's owned by the library of the Yale University. And a couple of years ago, one of the librarians flew to the Netherlands, presented the bond at the Dutch Water Board, and actually collected about 150 euros worth of interest. So that was neat. So we would like to claim in the Netherlands that the first green bond was issued by Dutch entity. Now, from an investor's perspective, this is like the gold standard. This is easy. Basically, what you do is, you have the Netherlands Water Board Bank issue a green bond. Now, the NWB is AAA rated. The reason why it's AAA rated, which is the highest credit rating that you can get, is because it can raise taxes from the citizens. So from an investor's perspective, this is easy. Even if all underlying projects fail, the investor will still get their money back. And if somehow the NWB doesn't have enough money, they will just simply go to the citizens and raise more taxes. Now, this is a lot of text, and I apologize for that. I'll just run through it very quickly. But I do want to get you a bit of a better grip on what exactly a bond is. It's very important to understand this. A bond is a fixed income financial instrument, and it raises capital from institutional investors, so pension funds, for example, or insurance companies. They invest in these bonds. You can look at a bond basically as a tradable debt. So it's the one thing that sets a bond apart from other financial instruments is that it is tradable. So, but otherwise, it's just like debt. You have principal, you have interest. You need to pay back the principal at some point. But you can trade it in the market. Now, a green bond is simply bond, but with some conditions attached. And as Jochen already mentioned, there's the green bond principles, and they have come together and develop basically rules for basically a few rules on how to make a bond green. So you have the use of proceeds, which means that prior to issuing, you must clearly describe what you're going to invest the money in. Is it renewable energy, or is it new train system, or it can be anything. There has to be a process for project evaluation and selection. So how does the project fit within the green bond projects categories? You have to, if you receive the money, you have to set aside that money. You can't just add it to the general budget, but you can have to ring fence it, set it aside. And if you don't use the money, there's also some rules that you can't use the money. For example, investing in something that is considered not green. So, for example, some temporary money from a coal company, for example, some short-term debt of a coal company. Now, finally, you need to report. Every 6 months or every year, you have to report on how you've been using the money. Once you've done all of that, you can say, okay, this bond is a green bond. Now, there's many different kinds of bonds, and I won't go into detail on that. There's project bonds, there's asset-backed securities, sovereign and agency bonds, municipal bonds, etc. I won't go into details on all of that, but the bottom line there is that from an investor's perspective, if the underlying projects do not perform, then do I run the risk on the performance of the projects, or do I run the risk on the credit worthiness of the issuer? So that is very important. And now, if that's not clear yet, it will become clear in a minute. Just to give you a little bit more detail on the green bond market, it's been growing very rapidly. In 2016, this is in US dollars, it was about 87 billion US dollars worth of green bonds, but that doubled already in 2017. And you will see that a big chunk of that goes into renewable energy. A big chunk of it goes into real estate, so low carbon buildings. A fair amount in clean transport. But what clearly is missing here, and what was one of the reasons why the Netherlands Enterprise Agency, so Caroline van Leenders and Martin Lok of the Ministry of Economic Affairs were interested in a report on green bonds for landscapes, is because they haven't been issued for landscape initiatives, not much or not at all, and at least not in a sort of a meaningful sense. Now, who is issuing these green bonds? Here you will find so the tall stack on your right hand. That's the year 2017. I'm sorry, that's missing from the presentation. But you will see that it's public banks that are very much involved in these in the green bond market. So in the Netherlands, you would have the NWB, you would have the municipal bank that issues green bonds. You will have also DFI, so development finance institutions, like the European Investment Bank that will issue green bonds. You will have FMO or Proparco that issues green bonds. So it's these kinds of entities. Corporate entities as well. So Unilever, for example, will have issued a green bond. There's a bunch of other corporates, like some EDF, for example, the Électricité de France, so the French electricity company, issued green bonds. So those are the types of green bonds. Now, one of the questions that we wanted to know is, can the Dutch government issue green bonds? Because the French government and the Polish government and so a bunch of other governments actually have issued green bonds as well. And the answer is, a lot of governments can issue green bonds, but the Netherlands government so far hasn't. And the reason for this is because if the government raises money through the capital markets, it is all added to the general budget. And right now, there's no rules that allow the government to ring fence those revenues. So you will see that there's, most of these companies are, big companies or public banks. Another variation on green bonds are impact bonds. And there was a bit of confusion. You may have heard of impact bonds. An impact bond is basically a contract, usually with public sector or entity, where the public sector entity pays for better social outcome, for example, youth unemployment or delinquencies. And it passes on part of the savings of this achieved back to investors. So you have an impact bond, you have an investor, they put up some money. There's an organization that carries out all kinds of activities, for example, making sure that young people get jobs. Once that organization is successful, then finally the government, who's basically pays for on an outcome basis. So it's a pay for success formula. Now, these social impact bonds are fundamentally different than a green bond. They're different in three ways. First of all, they're much smaller. So a social impact bond is, let's say up to 20 million or so, whereas a green bond is a minimum size, and that's really absolute minimum, 250 million. So Caroline and I have had different conversations, including with the Netherlands Water Bank. They said, we'll do a little bond of $1 billion. We're like, $1 billion? And then they will raise $1 billion, in about, let's say, a day, So that's clearly quite remarkable. So a green bond or green bond is really a capital markets instrument, whereas a social impact bond is much more on the, impact side. It's foundations that finance this kind of stuff. Now, the counterparty risk with the green bond is on the issuer generally, whereas the counterparty risk for an impact bond is really on the performance of the organization that carries out the activities, so on the outcomes. And also, green bond is generally tradable, so they are listed on all kinds of exchanges, whereas an impact bond is not tradable. So you invest, and then you get your money back or not. Now, the reason why we covered this is that even though we have seen very little examples, very few examples, very little evidence, but these impact bonds are really quite capable to achieve green outcomes. So to link the idea and the structure of an impact bond to green outcomes, environmental outcomes, is, I think, a very, very promising idea. And we will go into an example in a minute. By the way, if there's any questions thus far, then please let me know, or let Disha know. So we developed a few examples and 3 different landscape initiatives in the Netherlands, and see how such a green bond can play a role there. We looked at the IJsselmeer waterscape, which is a body of water north of Amsterdam. We looked at the city, Rotterdam, and we looked at a rather big problem for the Netherlands, which is peatland subsidence. I'll get into detail a little bit more which is a big problem in the Netherlands because about 10% of the Netherlands is peatlands, and it's sinking at a rate of about a centimeter a year, and in some places even worse than that. Given that we are already below the sea level, that means if we don't do anything about it, there'll be real serious economic damage to public infrastructure. So to start with the IJsselmeer waterscape, I was really quite happily surprised on the level of sophistication and the approach that this classic multi-stakeholder initiative displayed. So it's the Ministry of Infrastructure and Water Management that initiated this a few years ago, because they felt that even though there is an agenda to improve the management of the resources in and around the IJsselmeer, it was felt that they needed to look at this much more in an integrated way and involve a lot more, and different types of stakeholders. So the ministry is the lead convener of the multi-stakeholder platform. Now, looking at this, we thought that what is currently lacking with the with the multi-stakeholder platform is an entity that coordinates the different projects and try to arrange financing for these and build bridges, with financing institutions and investors. We noted that investors and banks, they're not yet involved in the multi-stakeholder platform. And this is a question and a challenge to everybody who's listening here today. That is, if you're involved in a multi-stakeholder initiative or in an integrated landscape initiative, to what extent are you already talking with banks? And one of the main conclusions from this report, but my work with IUCN in general, is that we should build those bridges, to the investor community, as early as possible. Investors, they're only interested in investing, once they see, a project that has, a risk analysis, a financial analysis, who's doing what, etc. But bankers actually are surprisingly nice people. You may not believe it, but they really are, and they're also, they have a lot of knowledge. They have networks. They're willing to help. A lot of these bankers have, a green beating heart, just like all of us here on this call, and they're happy to spend time with us and really donate for free their knowledge. So that's something that is really could add a lot of value for a lot of different initiatives around the world. Now, the role of green bonds in the IJsselmeer waterscape is really to engage public banks, already now, but certainly when it comes time to identifying, the concrete projects that require, capital. So the green bond in this case, would not be issued by the multi-stakeholder platform or not even like the investment platform, but rather by existing entities such as, the NWB, the Netherlands Water Board Bank, the municipalities or the provinces or even the central government. These are all the entities that can raise capital through, green bonds. The second example is in Rotterdam. Rotterdam is very interesting because it's the biggest harbor in Europe and one of the biggest in the world. It's also very low-lying, so they already for over a decade are very aware of the issue of climate change, and they're fighting against that. They have a climate adaptation program already in place, but at the same time, they also there's a lot of heavy industry there. And they are tasked to develop initiatives to transition into a low carbon economy, particularly now with the new cabinet that was installed last year. Now within the municipality, there's a finance and strategy department, and they've developed a whole portfolio of projects that have to be financed between now and 2030. So you have to think about, public schools, energy efficiency, etc. It's a whole portfolio of projects. But they also lack the capital, to finance all of that. So they are looking at green bonds, to see, okay, can we somehow lessen the burden on our budget through green bonds? And, the answer is yes, that's possible, through what they call green securitization. Whenever you hear the word securitization, you may doze off, fall asleep. There's a good football game on right now, and you may be want to look at that. Securitization was really at the heart of the financial crisis. That's where you. But securitization is a fantastic invention, and it basically means that you have a portfolio of projects and you slice it into different risk categories. And what you can do then is enhance the credit worthiness of that portfolio and say, we'll have the government or, a government-backed entity like a public bank, to invest in some of those to invest in the portfolio. So you move the whole portfolio of projects off the balance sheet of the government onto a special purpose vehicle. You raise capital against the future cash flow of that portfolio of projects. But because that's inherently risky, you basically you reduce the risk by saying, okay, let's say the first 50% of default is backed or by a government guarantee. So that's green securitization. I think Rotterdam is actively looking at that right now. So that's I think a very interesting possibility as well. But again, there's a strong involvement of a public entity that is well capitalized. The city of Rotterdam can borrow at very low rates. So this is a real opportunity for them. The last example that I want to highlight is the peatland example, which is an issue in the Netherlands because of subsidence. The subsidence, basically drying of peatland is a big problem. It releases a lot of CO2 as well, the equivalent of about 2 million cars every year. But mostly it causes a lot of damage to public infrastructure. So think of the sewer system, for example. Think of roads, electricity infrastructure, etc. Now, one possibility to counter this subsidence is by re-wetting the peatland. But if you do that, then the farmers get upset because the cows, they can't walk in the meadow anymore. So it's a big issue, and there's a lot of cows in the Netherlands. So it's a lot of farms in the Netherlands. So again, this is also where an integrated landscape management approach, having multi-stakeholders, having an integrated approach, can really make a difference. Now here, and we would be really building on some of existing work that's been going on already for a few years by, for example, Wetlands International, together with some local NGOs and farmer organizations, and even financial institutions that are involved, is to issue one of those impact bonds. So, which I mentioned before, which is like a social impact bond. But then, basically the government would pay for green outcomes. But what would be really needed in that case is that you need clearly defined criteria, measurable criteria that can serve as a basis for payments by public authorities. But that's a real opportunity, and we currently. Those impact bonds are, up, 20 million, 25 million. There's an interesting example in the United States, in Washington D.C. Water Authority that is issuing a green impact bond. So I think this is a very promising instrument, and I think we should explore that further. Unfortunately, right now, the status of the peatland issue is that it is a problem without a clear owner, because the problem is, is it a problem on a municipal level, on a provincial level? Is it a central government problem, etc.? We all know it's a problem, but nobody's right now taking responsibility for solving this. I think that pretty much sums up the body of my presentation. I think I'd like to share some takeaways right now. And then open the floor for further questions. You can read them yourself, clearly. There's, the issuer of a green bond, it has to be an investment grade entity, and the size of the bond should be a minimum of 250 million, but really we're talking about a minimum of 500 million US dollar. Green bonds are not very suitable for projects that are very early stage. We've seen some examples, we've analyzed some examples of that. For example, I think it was the Global Canopy program that tried something, to raise a green bond in in Brazil, I believe, but you know, it was just too difficult because, you know, banks, they look at this and they don't have the capacity to see whether, let's say, a portfolio of 20 projects, you know, whether project A would be doing well, project B maybe not so, etc. So that sort of went nowhere. So that also, you know, is pretty much takeaway 3, and that is these investors, they don't really think, you know, they don't have the capacity to analyze a whole portfolio. They just want to know, hey, are you an investment grade entity? Yes, you are. Are you AA, AAA rated? Great. So let's give you some money. These are a bunch of knuckleheads looking at 6 screens and you know, in a dealing room, and they're just pushing really big, large amounts of money. They want to do it in such a low risk way as possible. And my last takeaway is, you know, issuing or structuring a financial solution that may or may not include a green bond is very context specific. So if you're in Madagascar, you know, you need to really adapt it in sort of to the local circumstances. There is no one size fits all. You know, South America is very different from the Netherlands, from Madagascar. When it comes to the local circumstances and the entities and types of entities that are involved. Having said that, you know, the financial market is a global market, and all these bankers, you know, they all think alike. I mean, they all look at risk in the same way, and they're not going to change. So I think there's real ways where you can reduce some of this risk. There's real ways that you can build those alliances and build those bridges with the financial community, but I don't think that the financial community as a whole will change the way they finance such initiatives. That pretty much sums it up for now. And I'd love to, if we're all still awake and, you know, we haven't started watching, I think it's Poland against, I don't know who's playing right now, but, you know, love to hear your questions.
Great, thank you so much, Gerhard. If you do have questions, you're welcome to raise your hand. There is a button that you can choose, and if you click on participants, and it will allow you to click to raise your hands in case there's many. Give people a few minutes to absorb. Got Trevor Walter. Trevor, do you want to go first? You're the first one to raise your hand.
Thank you, and thank you, Gerhard, for the presentation. I think that it's really interesting, and I feel like probably a lot of us are coming from the perspective of these landscape initiatives where we have some initial ideas of different projects that we'd like to take forward, and some of them probably are not quite qualified yet. In the case you were talking about, these unproven concepts that don't have the certainty to go forward with funding. But when we do have something that is more proven, how do you bridge the gap between getting several projects or a portfolio of projects? How do you take that to an issuer or a potential issuer and try and talk to them about the possibilities for developing some kind of instrument, whether it's a green bond in itself or a green impact bond? What do you see that process as being?
It is difficult to the, I would say, point of almost impossible to issue green bonds on the back of a portfolio of projects. Particularly if those projects are very early stage and they haven't been developed yet. we have seen a really nice example of Yes Bank, which is an Indian bank, very innovative, very interesting. They've been involved in financing local renewable energy projects. So now they've structured those solutions. They financed these renewable energy projects. They're all operational right now. Now they want to move some of those renewable energy projects off their balance sheet into a special purpose vehicle. Basically have a project green bond issued against those renewable energy projects. So here we have operational renewable energy projects with a predictable cash flow, reasonably predictable, with credit-worthy power purchases of the power, etc. And yet, Yes Bank will have to absorb, let's say, the first 20% or 30% of the losses, potential losses, of that particular portfolio. Otherwise, they will not get institutional investors interested in investing in it. So Yes Bank already, good bank, the type of asset, proven technology, etc. So really, I would say the only way to approach, or I would probably clearly need a little bit more information about this. But what I would advise to do is to see, okay, what sort of financial flows are happening in your geographical area? Which banks are financing what? Have you done is there an assessment? Is there real good structural knowledge of who does what within your landscape? And go to those entities and say, okay, can you finance this? And then, if you go to these entities and, you want them to finance a particular project, you need to have your homework done, right? You can't go with sort of a half-baked, Excel spreadsheet with, you know what I mean? Yeah, it has to look good, it has to look professional. Then you get them involved. And then you can pitch in, and apply and see whether there's local financing available. If you have really good size, and it also depends on, who's doing the projects. Is it, let's say, a local water authority that is interested in investing 30 million in, let's say, rehabilitating a wetland that has the function of, let's say, filtering water rather than building another piece of gray infrastructure. That could be interesting, right? So particularly if that water authority is, a credit-worthy water authority. Unfortunately, many of them are not, particularly in developing countries. So, you need to look at local financing as much as possible, come prepared as much as you can. And once you have, let's say, some assets that are big enough and that are already operational with stable cash flows, that's when you can start thinking about, okay, a green bond may be an opportunity. Does that help you? Is that sort of?
Well, I think it's a tall order, but yes, it is helpful to know what the expectation is. I think that that there are certainly the idea that we can't go with something that's initial or half baked or things like that. But I think that what a lot of the things that we're trying to do across the offices I'm working with, at least, are things that that up until now have been difficult to finance, and so we need to find some of these cases where we can have operational projects that say what's really happening, and then be able to scale those up with an instrument like this. So hopefully we'll be able to do that and begin those conversations.
And well, one of the things that I mentioned is is that these, I was saying it sort of jokingly, but these bankers, they're they're actually they're nice. Not all of them, but they can be nice, and they have much more than just money to offer, right? They have networks, they have ideas, they have structuring solutions. They can help you think along and develop a strategy for that. That's real knowledge that can be tapped into. They can help you, do some of the calculations, etc., and do some of the risk analysis. I was working with the folks from Agricultural Partners to develop the LIFT, which is the Landscape Investment Finance tool. Part of that actually also has an Excel spreadsheet that should be able to help you to, run some of the numbers, right? So you plug in some revenue numbers and some cost numbers, and then some discount factors, and then you come up with present value, etc. So that can help you, make you look good for these investors. And we've run some workshops, including in the Philippines. And as soon as we started talking about money, and we had we got a different audience than you would normally expect from the Landscape Initiative platform meeting, let's say. These were people from local government authorities, the people from local banks, etc. And they were extremely willing to help, just help you make connections, and like I said, so I think that would be a really good starting point, and see if you can get some of these local finance guys involved.
I just want to switch over to Parisa next, if that's okay, just because she has a question, and then we'll follow with Carolina, who's got her hand raised.
Hi, thank you again. I'm an ex-banker too.
Excellent.
So I can tell you the same, like Gerhard, that there is so much experience there. So there are so many different projects, similar projects. So they are good sparring partners. One thing I just wanted to add for people around, like in Madagascar or non-European countries, it's always a matter of political issues. So in Netherlands and in Germany and in Europe, it's easy to have the right stakeholders, and the political circumstances are easy to build up such a project. But something I'm thinking, I'm new at WWF. Sometimes I think we have to go more to such public institutions like World Bank and so on, and make such a combination of public money and private money. So the securitization comes from the World Bank, and the rest of the money comes from private, from the private sector. It's just my experience in the last 4 months that WWF does not really use the possibilities from the public side. It's just my experience in the last 4 months. Yes, that was it. Because if you get a public bank on your side, and they give you the securitization for the private money, so it's much easier. I hope you understood me.
Yes, and actually I had a very nice chat yesterday with Aaron Vermeulen. He's a finance guy at the WWF Netherlands office, and he mentioned, and I mean it was too quick. I didn't write it down, but he mentioned that WWF has been working with the World Bank on a project that I think is now leading to like 100 million plus investment by the World Bank. See, one of the things that when I joined IUCN, and I looked at it from a banker's perspective, and I thought there's so much value created by the work that you guys do, that we do, and yet we're not capitalizing on that. We're not scaling quickly enough. And in order to scale, we just need to, unfortunately, perhaps, but there's just not enough public money available, to achieve the scale that is required. So to have that mindset, also, to involve and work with the private sector and private sector banks, and structure solutions that involve, blending of public and private finance, I think is a really, it's the only way to go. And I think WWF has a lot going. And I think that, there's a Bankable Projects Initiative within the WWF network. Disha knows about that. So there's a lot of stuff that's happening, and that I think you guys have most definitely, you're ahead of the pack, at least in some parts within the network. Disha, do you have any thoughts on that? Or?
I thought that actually this could be potential for Jochen to mention that, because Jochen's also involved.
Could I also chip in, please?
Sorry, yes.
for a second, thank you. There's two things that can help you out if you're thinking about working in a landscape and thinking about financing. One is a tool that is recently put on the internet by IUCN, the Landscape Investment Finance Tool, which is a tool meant for people working in landscapes on sustainability and try to make them a bit more financial literate and understanding what financial flows are already connected to a landscape and what kind of business cases you can develop within a landscape to make a return. Because if you want investors, you have to have things in a landscape that are making a return. Eco-Agricultural Partners has been developing this tool together with IUCN, and they are now also going to start an online training how to use the tool. So before thinking about a green bond or a green impact bond, it might be wise to see if you can use the LIFT tool, the Landscape Investment Finance Tool, to become a bit more literate on finance stuff. The other thing that I would like to mention is the topic of blended finance. All the big NGOs, IUCN, WWF, Conservation International, they're all now working within different offices on blended finance thinking. How can you use public money, whether it's World Bank or development bank money or bank from governments, together with private money, and that is also all kind of different kinds of money: impact investors, institutional investors, crowdfunders. I've just been to a meeting of Conservation International on blended finance. There's all kind of different models being experimented now with. The OECD just brought out a few guidelines on blended finance, and I'm trying to get a kind of small study going on what kind of blended finance models are now being experimented with within different landscapes. See if I can do it together with Eco-Agricultural Partners and with the World Resource Institute. So I think it is a really interesting time to take stock and to learn and share all the different models and experimenting that is going on around the world. So maybe also within this community and with the Landscape Finance Lab, we can bring together the different forms of blended finance that are now tried, and whether it then turns out into a green bond, that's just a way, but there's many different ways and funds that are now being set up. So I think that this is a good time to share. So if people have interesting ideas or examples, it might be good to see if we can collect them and take it to a next level.
Brilliant, thanks, Carolina. The only thing I was going to add was if Jochen's still on the line, maybe he could elaborate a little bit more as well about the work that's going on within WWF that he's leading on from the green bonds perspective as well as the bankable project side of things. Jochen, are you still around?
Yes. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Just to let you know that there will be another session dedicated to WWF's work on green bonds, which is much more focused on the market perspective, using experience gathered over the last 2 decades in defining sustainability standards. Because while Gerhard rightly outlined what is commonly understood by the term green bond, there is still a lack of robust and credible and effective standards in that market. That's one of the threats to the markets. So I'm currently, I'm a member of the finance practice. I'm also a member of the leadership team of the finance practice. And we've been asked to put together a proposal for what's called high impact initiative or signature initiative under the finance practice, focusing on green bonds. And what we will, our current thinking, so in the concept stage for that, but our current thinking is to focus on 2 things. The first is nurturing and developing the standards that are currently under development. There are some very exciting recent developments, in particular in Europe, where the European Commission has, after 1 year of working with the high-level expert group on sustainable finance, has now decided to, or has now published a draft regulation, which also includes the development of a European standard for green bonds. Of course, I mean, this can go very right or very wrong. It can go into the right direction and become a tool for greenwashing, or it can be really a good tool to strengthen and make the market more robust. WWF has been asked to join the expert group who will be working on that standard for the next 12 to 18 months. So that's quite an exciting development for us. There will be another session to give you more details about that. And the second exciting development is an international standard, so not a European standard, but an international standard which would apply to all types of issues from all types of jurisdictions under the International Standards Organization, ISO. It has a number. It's not ISO 14000, but it's ISO 14030, which is currently being developed, and which is also expected to be ready for the market to use it in the next 18 months, and WWF is also deeply involved in that. So that's sort of in a nutshell what we're trying to drive in the network. It can become a little bit complicated, but what we hope to achieve in this initiative is to really influence the direction that the market takes, so that it doesn't that it takes a broader view and doesn't only focus on climate, which is the current tendency, but that it also captures and encompasses a broader picture in terms of natural resource consumption, in terms of biodiversity and so forth, to make sure that the market has a robust, credible and effective standards to work with. That's it in a nutshell, and if you're interested in hearing more about, you can contact me or somebody else from the finance practice in your country to find out more about it. Over. I'm happy to take questions, by the way.
Yeah, just as a comment on that, I mean, the lack of common standards is problematic, and I think you guys are doing great work on that, Jochen. As an example, you know, Caroline and I, we went to the Netherlands Municipal Bank, and you know, they basically they've developed their own methodology, and frankly, I think you can shoot some pretty big holes in that methodology. But yet, you know, the way it works right now is that the issuer can say, hey, it's green. It's green to our standards. So, you know, nobody says how green it needs to be. Is deep dark green? Does it need to be very light green, etc.? So there is that risk of greenwashing, which I think would be damaging for the development of the market. So it's very important indeed that, you know, more clarity that's needed, you know, on these different standards. So good work on that.
And I guess the only other thing to add was that when you mentioned about the bankable projects work, that's something we're collaborating with the Freshwater Practice Finance Practice and also IUCN and Eco Agriculture to host a training session in September. So that would be September/October. The date's to be confirmed. So we'll send out information about that shortly once that's organised. But there are plans to launch a bankable projects incubator on the Landscape Finance Lab platform as well. So this is something that we're hoping to develop and draw people's opinions and feedback in as that goes along. So we'll keep you in the loop as that goes. But before, because as I'm seeing that we're actually out of time, but if anybody did have any burning questions, maybe we can send them on the chat, and this is something that we can collate for Gerhard and we can post as a blog later, if that's okay. Otherwise, I'd like to thank everyone for joining the session, and if you do have any questions, you've got Gerhard's contact details here as well, but feel free to get in touch if you'd like any other follow-up information.